The Shin Megami Tensei series is developer and publisher Atlus's primary game franchise, with well over 30 games from 6 main entries and the rest being from various sub-series. Although Shin Megami Tensei itself is something of a spin-off series, spawned from the Megami Tensei series, which is based on a series of novels of the same name by Aya Nishitani. The actual Megami Tensei series only consists of 2 entries, aptly named Megami Tensei 1 and 2, with the first game closely following the novels and the sequel taking more liberties. The original game released for family computers in 1987, published by Namco, and saw a watered-down port for the MSX from Telenet Japan. Megami Tensei is based on Megami Tensei Digital Devil Story by Nishitani. Atlus would later gain publishing rights to its own games after buying the rights to Nishitani's series. The original title was primarily a dungeon-crawling RPG in a manner familiar to the Wizardry series, although Megami Tensei took place in a modern-day setting with a slight cyberpunk flavor, which saw the end of the world and the beginning of the post-apocalypse, with demons running amok. Aside from exploring a grid-based locations like towns, dungeons, and fighting demons in turn-based combat, players could negotiate with demons. Depending on how the negotiation went, the demon would either run away, use a surprise attack, or in a best-case scenario, join the player's party. Megami Tensei established many of the mechanics of the SMT series, of which it is still known for today, like the aforementioned negotiation and demon fusion, as well as a punishing level of difficulty. The final game in the Megami Tensei series, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei 2, released again for family computers in 1990. This game was also notable for not following the source material by Nishitani. This largely followed the same formula established previously. Both games later came packaged in a remake for the Super Famicom in March 31st, 1995 on a single cartridge. This version was titled Kayaku Megami Tensei, or, as it's commonly known in English, Megami Tensei The Old Testament. This version, like many re-releases on the Super Famicom, saw enhanced graphics and music as well as some new features, like a saving and fast travel system. Some dungeons were slightly changed as well, along with an eased encounter rate and an auto battle option. This version of the game also saw fan translation, but never an official localization. The actual Shin Megami Tensei series began as 2 games released for the Super Famicom in 1992 and the sequel Shin Megami Tensei 2 in 1994. Both games were considered by the development staff of Atlus to be remakes of the original Megami Tensei games. Both titles feature many fan translations, but again, never an official release outside of Japan. Well, unless you count that weird mobile version of the first game. Sadly, this trend of remaining exclusive to Japanese systems remained for years, as both the Megami Tensei and Shin Megami Tensei games featured mature, dark storylines, sexual innuendos, and with a heavy dose of the occult, along with a plethora of religious references, all of which were something of a taboo in the West at the time. These factors and more would result in the series not seeing a release on Western shores until 1995. In October 1995, the first Megami Tensei game to see a Western release is the spin-off title Jack Bros, which released for the Virtual Boy. This game is a 2D platformer spin-off based on the Atlus mascot of sorts, Jack Frost and his brothers. Although this is technically the first Megaten game to have a Western release, it will not be the focus of this video. More importantly, September 20th, 1996 saw the Western release of Revelations Persona for the PlayStation, which is a spin-off title of the Shin Megami Tensei series. Are you still following all of this? The only connection between Persona and the main Megaten series are thematic and mechanical, which I'll get into later. Now, I feel this goes without saying, but the focus of this retrospective is the Shin Megami Tensei series legacy in the West. As such, I will be only looking at games in this RPG series that have received a Western release, and it all started with the original Persona. As well, this series of videos are reviews of the individual games. I will not be looking at how the entire series connects, as the SMT timeline is even more confusing and distorted than the Zelda timeline, although there are videos out there that address this, and I would recommend watching those for that purpose. With all that said, let the Shin Megami Tensei retrospective begin proper. Kept you waiting, huh? Revelations Persona is quite the interesting title, especially given the time of its release. Its original launch in 1996 was before the grand RPG boom of 1997, which was triggered by the release of Final Fantasy VII. Unlike many other RPGs of the time, which either took place in a fantasy or sci-fi setting, Persona, like its Mega 10 forebears, took place in a, at the time, modern-day setting of 1996. Persona is the first role-playing entry in the Mega 10 series to receive a localization, although the Persona series didn't have Shin Megami Tensei in their titles until Persona 3. The game was localized by the recently established Atlus USA. Persona was selected as a title to receive a Western release to help define and set Atlus apart from other RPG publishers, like Konami, Capcom, and obviously, Squaresoft. The team responsible for localizing Persona was fairly small, and they had the enormous task of translating a very dialogue-heavy game, as well as somehow tiptoeing around the occult and mature themes that prevented previous games from coming westward. This team also had to adapt a game filled with Japanese references to an American audience. All of these factors resulted in what many consider to be one of, if not Atlus's most butchered, localization effort. The Revelations Persona localization remains infamous to this very day. The Western release differs greatly from the original. Some of these changes include the game taking place in America rather than Japan, which in turn resulted in the whitewashing of various characters, with many cast members having their skin and hair color changed to appear more American. The most notorious of these changes being the transformation of Maseo into Mark, going from a Japanese comic relief character into an African-American male because, America. This change in setting also resulted in various name changes for various locations and very different dialogue. Also, an entire side quest route of the Snow Queen being entirely cut out from the game. More than a decade later, a remake released for the PlayStation Portable on September 22, 2009. The remake was much more faithful to the original Japanese version, which almost entirely removes all of the changes of Revelations Persona. This version includes new music, cutscenes, and the entire Snow Queen side quest restored. This PSP remake will serve as the basis for this review, as it is the definitive version of Persona 1 on top of being more readily available for the PSP, PlayStation Vita, and PlayStation TV via the PlayStation Network. Although I will mention key differences of both versions when applicable. I will also refer to the PSP version when talking about both game mechanics and plot elements. With all that said, let's get into the story. Persona takes place in 1996, a group of students from St. Hermine High, the town's local high school, playing a fortune-telling game called Persona. Among this group of friends is the silent protagonist, whom the player can name. After playing this game, everyone in the room witnesses a ghostly figure and are rendered unconscious. The protagonist has a vision of a man named Philemon, telling our hero that he has gained the power to use his other self, his persona. Philemon then warns the protagonist that his power will soon be needed and fades away. It's not long before the town experiences a variety of strange phenomena, the appearance of strange demon-like creatures that represent the manifestations of people's inner darkness, and a zombie apocalypse for starters. If I had to describe the entire plot of Persona in a single sentence, it would go something along the lines of Inceptions but with demons everywhere. The overall narrative is still quite intriguing to this day, seeping with psychological references dwelling on the darker truths of society. It's not the greatest story ever told, but it did keep me interested in seeing it through to the end. It's also notable for being quite different from every other RPG of the time. The cast of Persona is quite large, with many characters, among which there are very interesting characters, and many that have their own troubles and tribulations that they have to get through by the end of the game. One of the game's more interesting features were that players could handpick different party members if they fulfill certain requirements, which can also be different depending if you're going for the main story route or the Snow Queen quest in the PSP version. Persona has a lot of replayability, both due to the different story quests and that you can only really learn about the characters that join your party, encouraging you to play through the game again to learn about the others you didn't pick. So overall, the story and characters are engaging, and the setting really set Persona apart from many RPGs of the 90s, but that can only carry an RPG so far. The game has a wealth of mechanics and features, as well as a variety of different navigation styles. These different styles include moving your party from an overhead map, represented with simple icons, and certain safe locations like shops in an angle third-person view. In Dungeons, you'll explore the environments from a first-person dungeon crawler perspective, moving one square in the grid at a time. This in of itself isn't a bad thing, but since many of the environments repeat textures throughout each location, it can be very easy to lose your sense of direction and get lost in these dungeons. You do have a map, so you'll never be entirely lost, but over the course of the game, the dungeon layouts get increasingly complex, which can take an infuriating long time to get through, especially with random battles happening fairly frequently. Speaking of battles, Persona uses a very interesting battle system that provides players with a wealth of options. Battles take place in a grid-based arena, with each enemy and party member moving and attacking in accordance to where they are located on the grid, which can even result in enemies or your own allies being unable to attack one another. In battle, you have 4 options. Attack, with either a character's melee or a ranged weapon, which are basically just guns. Each weapon type has a different physical property, some are effective against different types of enemies. Each party member can use magic as well, and this is where personas come into play. In battle, you can equip different persona to each character, although depending on their arcana, certain persona work best with specific characters. Each persona can learn up to 8 skills, which include different types of physical attacks and spells. One of the key elements of battle is using the appropriate skills. For instance, using spells that are effective against certain enemies deal additional damage, or some enemies can be immune to certain skills. The persona you equip also have different strengths and weaknesses, meaning that certain types of enemy attacks may be less or more effective against them. As such, you'll be switching persona quite often. The other battle options include Analyze, which evaluates an individual enemy's strengths and weaknesses, Form, that allows you to change your party formation, which is often necessary to attack certain outer range enemies, and Contact, which allows you to enter the series' infamous demon negotiations. Although negotiating in Persona works a little differently than other Mega 10 games. Depending on the demon's personality or the certain phase of the moon, the results of that conversation can change drastically, as they respond differently to certain actions. When negotiating, the demon will typically say something seemingly random or ask you, the player, a question. Sometimes the player will be able to begin the conversations. Regardless of who starts talking first, you need to choose an option to trigger one of 4 emotional responses from a demon: anger, fear, joy, and interest. Triggering one of these responses 3 times will cause the demon to perform an action. If you make a demon angry, it will attack whoever it was speaking with. A scared demon will flee the battle. A joyful demon will give the player an item or money. And finally, an interested demon can leave the battle, give you an item, or preferably, give the player a tarot card, which are needed to gain new persona. As you may have guessed, these negotiations can take a while. There are also too many factors that can impact the results of these conversations. Nothing is more frustrating than spending time to learn a demon's behavior to get 2 of the 3 interested responses only to get 3 other responses in a row, resulting in squandering the opportunity to get a new tarot card. While negotiating can be interesting, it's also a huge pain in the ass. Grinding for new tarot cards has never been something I have found to be fun. The overall battle system, while fairly robust and intriguing, can be very time-consuming in the mid to late game, which can be especially frustrating in some of those later dungeons. Aside from battle, you can enter the Velvet Room, a trans-dimensional room featuring some very interesting characters, including the long-nosed host, Igor, who has since been in every single Persona game. The Velvet Room is quite important, since this is where you can create new persona using tarot cards earned by enemies. You can also fuse persona to create a new one. This newly created persona can inherit skills from those used in the fusion. The Velvet Room can be accessed in dungeons and while in town. In dungeons, you may also stumble upon Trish, the money-obsessed fairy who can restore your entire party to full strength, provided you pay her increasingly exorbitant fees. You'll also be periodically returning to town or the school to purchase new armor, weapons, and accessories, or interact with different NPCs to progress the story. As a whole, playing through the game can sometimes feel like a chore, grinding for new tarot cards or levels, trying to navigate the various dungeons, and just managing your party and their persona can be very draining. Persona is not a game you can simply pick up and play whenever you feel so inclined. Many of the mechanical elements of the game were considerably unique in 1996, but not all of these ideas have aged gracefully. While the story and characters are still engaging, the overall gameplay now feels archaic. Not bad, mind you, but severely dated, something that only the dedicated will be able to fully enjoy. Being an early PlayStation title, the game also appears fairly dated, especially the game's use of 3D. The character sprites lack detail and are not of a very high quality, which is a shame since the artwork of Kazuma Kanoko, which is used for the character portraits, look fantastic, and the sprites simply do his artwork no service, although the sprites for the different persona are distinct and have much more detail. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the dungeons which are 3D use repeated textures which make them look similar and boring. Some of the different towns and the different rooms that you'll be going to all kind of blend together as well, as they don't look very distinct. The actual area designs don't get interesting until much later in the game. The PSP remake features new cutscenes for key narrative points, all of which look pretty awesome, and are a great example of 3D animation done right. Now the music on the other hand is great, although the soundtracks differ quite a bit for Revelations Persona and the PSP version. The PlayStation version uses a very atmospheric soundtrack that suits the dark and mysterious nature of the narrative quite well. The PSP version, on the other hand, is a completely different story. After the release of many other games in the Mega 10 series, including later Persona games, Shoji Meguro, who is the main composer for all the Shin Megami Tensei games, did the music for the remake. As such, the music in the PSP game sounds completely different, consisting of much more cheerful J-pop music that the later Persona games are well known for now. While I do enjoy many songs of the PSP remake, such as the opening and various boss battle themes, I don't think the new soundtrack suits the game very well. I personally prefer the soundtrack from Revelations Persona, as I feel that it simply suits the game better. So, should you play Persona or Revelations Persona? It's hard to say. The game has simply not aged well. As such, I cannot fully recommend you play it, but if you are interested in the title for its story or historic value as the first role-playing game of the series to have a Western release, and for those reasons, I could recommend you struggle your way through the game, especially if you want to get the most from its sequels. If you are interested in playing the game, I would recommend the PlayStation Portable release, which again is available on the PlayStation Network. If you are hell-bent on playing Revelations Persona, the game is fairly tricky to track down and will set you back at least $40 to $50 on sites like eBay. The game should take most players around 30-40 hours to complete, but if you plan doing the Snow Queen side quest, you can add another 15 to 20 hours on top of that. Good luck. I hope you'll join me next time, as I'll be looking at the next installment in the Megami Tensei series to receive a Western release, which is something of an unknown game. As always, been Darren of the Gaming Pilgrimage. Till next time. Hey, did you know that I have a podcast? You can find it on iTunes, or recently we moved all of the episodes over to SoundCloud at the Gaming Pilgrimage Podcast. It's me and my two buddies, Brock and Alex. We talk about all matter of video games, RPG news, and we, generally talk about what we've been playing recently. It's a fun time if you're interested. It's available again on iTunes or on SoundCloud, so be sure to check it out. Our most recent episode featured us doing a spoiler cast on the events Persona 4 Golden. As always, thanks for watching, and catch you next time, guys.